Welcome to Creepy Confidential. I'm your host, Noelle, your resident weirdo Wisconsinite. I open case files on cryptids, cults, conspiracies, and otherworldly creepy, bringing you new cases, live broadcasts, and local lore. So get ready, creeps. It's Creepy Confidential. June 17th, 1926, Green Lake Park, Seattle, Washington. A local carpenter is walking on the north end of the park on his way to work when he came across a pair of women's shoes. These shoes were near a small grove of alder trees at the edge of the water. Confused, he proceeds a little further to the shore, only to discover a nearly naked woman. Sprawled out, a bloodied rock, and a severe head wound. The Gaines murder case became one of the most sensational in Seattle's history, with everyone asking, but who would do such a thing? It turns out the murderer would actually confess. In a drunken stupor, the confession happened on the same night of these heinous acts. The murderer was not some random fiend or foreign foe, but a local man, someone she trusted, and even rumored to have potentially welcomed into her bed. Wallace Cloyce Gaines, her father. To this day, encounters of a female spirit wandering around the lake have been reported. Many of the locals attribute these sightings to the restless soul of Sylvia Gaines. Sup, creeps? Today we are talking about the true crime case and haunting of Sylvia Gaines, aka the Gaines Point murder, and also the paranormal label of the Green Lake Ghost. Now, this case rocked the city of Seattle in 1926. What's crazy is, as if a young woman being found naked and slain by a public lake wasn't bad enough, the inner workings of this story are so dark and twisted, and they ultimately may be why the event literally still haunts the Green Lake Park in an area now known as Gaines Point. Broken family, incest, drunken confessions, and a witness putting the perpetrator there at the exact time and place. Now, I came across this case when I was actually researching another case for my team for a paranormal investigation, and it turned into a serious rabbit hole and actually turned into an investigation in itself. So let's break this crazy murder case down, and then we're going to review the most insane vocal evidence I've ever recorded. Not an EVP, not something that sounds like blah, 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 horrible when you listen to it. It is an actual voice, actually two voices, that came across our walkie-talkies in an area where this did not belong. There was nobody talking on the walkie-talkies, and it was insane. Now, I've recorded tons of voices, EVPs, recordings over the years. I'm very able to determine the difference between the two. This voice popped up on this investigation was a full transatlantic accent from a man's voice, and it was potentially reenacting the murder. We also soon discovered on the night of that investigation that the time that we were there investigating was the time of the murder and the time of death, but of course in modern day. But we were there at the exact time that this potentially took place. It was more of an imprint, maybe, like a loop in time that was playing across our walkie-talkies. But I'm going to talk about that later because that was just insane. So let's start at the very beginning. Sylvia Gaines was born in 1904 in Middlesex County, Massachusetts. Not a whole lot is known about her earlier life, as it was most likely, uneventful, normal kid stuff. The first event, though, that kind of popped up on her life radar is when her parents separated in 1909, when she was just 5 years old. But then she went along. Nothing else seemed to pop up on her little timeline. She graduated from Peabody High School in 1921 with the distinction of Merit Scholar awarded to her. Sylvia then enrolled in Smith College in the fall to go on to graduate in 1925. Now she's 21 years old, and she reestablishes contact with her estranged father, Wallace Gaines, aka Bob. Now keep in mind, she and her father had not spoken in 16 years when Sylvia was just a small child when they separated. Now in September of 1925, she left home in Lynnfield, Massachusetts to visit her father in Seattle. By all accounts, Mr. Gaines was overjoyed to meet the beautiful young woman his daughter had become. Now, she stayed at her father's home for several months, purportedly causing considerable friction between her father and his second wife, Elizabeth. Now, Bob was a 46-year-old World War I veteran on disability from shell shock and was an alcoholic. Now, for those of you who don't know what shell shock is, it's known as kind of the modern day PTSD, but they're not exactly the same. We may hear this word applied to veterans and those who have experienced war in a modern day setting. However, it's actually a historical term. So back specifically in World War I, veterans following the Battle of Loos, the terminology kind of started to get changed into World War II. So in World War II, it was called the combat stress reaction and symptoms, kind of started to change. But that's kind of a side note. So that you know that specifically World War I was so messed up that it got its own little label for these poor veterans that were coming back. So I explain this not to side with Mr. Gaines, but to explain this man had some of the worst kind of military trauma applied to his little noodle. Now, Bob was maintaining his finances with help from a little more well-off family member. Lucky for him, his brother was on the chair of the King County Board of Commissioners. Now, King County's in Washington. I used to live there, so that's how I know. King County Board of Commissioners. Now, according to Mrs. Gaines, now Elizabeth, the booze was the actual catalyst for some of the difficulties going on within that time. Now, whatever the cause, these problems became just so severe to the point that Mrs. Gaines actually attempted suicide in November of 1925. So that was just after Sylvia got there. Now, to add to the drama of this story, there's kind of a piece of information that I haven't mentioned yet. It was rumored and potentially witnessed. The local hotel clerks reported they saw Bob and Sylvia sharing a hotel room, and police reported finding them parked in Lover's Lane, back when we used to do Lover's Lane. So now those who don't know what Lover's Lane is, it's basically two people hanging out in a car, necking, doing the deed, that sort of thing. But you also have to remember Sylvia is 21 and Bob is 46, and this is her father. So after reading about that, it kind of explained why there was such tension between Mrs. Gaines and Sylvia. Because, doesn't matter what time frame in the world, what decade we're in, what century we're in, that is typically frowned upon. So to set this whole thing off, now that we have our backstory, apparently Sylvia was trying to break this forbidden love, and this is what set Bob off. Sylvia vanished June 16th, 1926, following an argument with her father. And then the next morning is where the Carpenters come in. Where the Carpenter is walking across the park, over on the other end, and that's where he comes across the body near the lake. Now, this murder case was front page news for months, not only showing up in newspapers local to Seattle, but across the globe. Seattle was shocked and fascinated by all these details that emerged kind of concerning this young woman's life and death and the relationship later that they'd find out. The biggest thing was who would kill this young woman. So they started collecting their evidence, right? But it really started to add up pretty quickly. On the morning of the 17th, they questioned Mr. Gaines. He was drunk and made statements suggesting that he knew who the murderer was. Investigators managed to bring up several of the Gaines's neighbors and friends who saw him on the night of the murder, very drunk and disturbed at his daughter's disappearance. Apparently, he was up all night searching for her. Now, initially, there was kind of the fiend theory that there was some local fiend out there killing people, killing ladies, and that was raping and killing them. But to squash that, one of the court prosecutors that's found that no one, neither neighbors nor people walking by the lake or near the murder site, had heard any outcry, which means that Sylvia knew her murderer. Witnesses reported seeing Gaines at the lake shore around 9 o'clock that evening, near where Sylvia's body was later found. He was bending over something or someone, and other witnesses said that he saw him driving around the lake several times at the time of the murder. Now, Sylvia was strangled, and her head had been battered with a blunt instrument, which is that bloodied rock that they had found, and that was ultimately the cause of death. They think that she died somewhere around 9 o'clock that night. So 9 o'clock puts Mr. Gaines there, 9 o'clock potentially the time of death. Now, what's even slightly crazier about this whole finding her and the positioning, later in the court, the testimony would be established that she had been murdered in one spot and that her body had been dragged to another several yards away and arranged in a manner to suggest that she had been sexually assaulted, even though she had not. Now, during the questioning, Gaines testified that he and Sylvia had quarreled on the evening of June 16th. Sylvia, probably ticked off from the conversation, left the home and went down the street shortly after 8 p.m. for a walk around the lake. Gaines said he left at about 8:40 when he drove around nearby streets looking for her and then drove to the home of his friend and drinking companion, Louis Stern. Now here's where it gets crazy. Mr. Stern testified, and his evidence was absolutely damning. He reported that Bob came to his house to drink and all but confessed that he'd murdered his daughter. Gaines said, quote, "You know what I have always told you, that if anyone in my house told me when I should come and go, and when I should drink and how much, why, I would kill them. Well, that's what happened." End quote. Now, the prosecutor had established when, where, and how Sylvia had been killed, but he had yet to provide a motive. His theory was that Gaines and his daughter had been in this unnatural relationship, as they put it, and Gaines knew that Sylvia wanted to leave his home. She'd made plans to go stay with her uncle William, and that he'd killed her to keep her from leaving him or exposing this affair. Now, within the documents that you can read about this, what's crazy is that this relationship was happening between her and her father from shortly after she arrived. And they were living in a one-bedroom house. Sylvia was sleeping on the couch, and yet they were finding time to have relations, and the wife was there in a one-bedroom house. There's no way that she didn't know about it, and yet apparently she just stayed at his side the whole time. It's just crazy to me. Even though, also within there, it says that at the time, Sylvia and her father were threatening to leave the home and to get an apartment. This just gets deeper and deeper. Because the neighbor had said that She believed that the two were sharing a bed and that Mrs. Gaines actually slept on the couch. I'm sorry, but if something crazy like this happened, right? I mean, we don't have, but something happened. Someone showed up, a relative, and that happened in my house? Oh, nope. Absolutely not. Everyone would be exposed and they'd be out of the house. No. So it makes sense to me now that this is the motive, right? He's angry. To him, this is his lover, even though it's his daughter, and she wanted out. I don't know if she figured out, hey, this is wrong, or, whatever. Clearly, something went crazy. And I think he lost his mind. And then to make it look like she'd been raped and killed, he tore her clothes, drug her body near to kind of the path, and then arranged her limbs kind of to suggest that something had happened. He continued to then guzzle down the booze and then went over to Lewis's house and confessed the whole dang thing. So ultimately, Mr. Gaines was tried for this crime. The jury deliberated a little over 3 hours and found Gaines guilty. He was sentenced to die. He appealed his case, but of course was unsuccessful. August 31st, 1928, in Walla Walla, Washington, he was hung. Following the execution, his body was transported to the Veterans Memorial Cemetery at Evergreen Memorial Park for burial with full military honors. Wow. Sylvia was cremated and sent back to Massachusetts, where she was buried. In modern day Green Lake Park, those original trees have been torn down. They did replace them with different trees, and they tore those down, and now they've put up poplar trees. So I mention that because it's hard to find the original spot. You have to kind of find the map, but also it's like when you buy a house, well, someone buys a house, they start doing construction, and then all of a sudden they have paranormal activity. I think that this was meant to be a memorial spot. They put up those original trees for her, and now they've been torn down and replaced, and torn down and replaced. And I think that has something to do with it. If you can have an opinion about that. And it also kind of decreases that memory of her. The story needs to not go away. It is a very scandalous story, but it has a part of history, which is important. Now I start to mention the paranormal things because now we're going to talk about the paranormal side. So we built up this whole case, and you know what happened. So think about the trauma. Think about what happened. The kind of the crazy energy going on between the two of these, people, and then it culminates in this awful, awful thing. So our team went and investigated there, and because we had heard about this Green Lake ghost, we happened to be there at the almost exact time of murder, right around just before 9:00 at night. And while we didn't get tons of other sustainable evidence for viewing, it was fairly quiet throughout the day until it was about that time. We had these walkie-talkies so that we could communicate. We were kind of on the map, if you look at the map, the initial point where she went in the water, came down, and came back up, we wanted to have 2 teams positioned on either side of here. And so we had walkie-talkies. It wasn't a huge distance, and we hadn't had any other interference throughout the night. So it was very clear to us, that there wasn't anybody else on our petition, special station that we chose. And all of a sudden, this guy still gives me goosebumps to think about it. We got this crazy voice that popped up. And I'm going to play the audio for you here in just a second. And you have to keep in mind, it's coming across a walkie-talkie, but it is still the same voice. And we hear another voice that's a female. So the first one, we have all this evidence. We have all this trauma. And now we're going to finally play the clips for you. Now these clips will play through, remember they are through 2 different walkie-talkies. They are positioned so that one was at the entry point to the water. The other person was just a little bit down the waterway, and it was at where she came back out of the water and where the murder was committed. And we were there at this started popping off at the time of the murder. So when you listen to this clip, you'll hear a man, transatlantic accent. You'll hear his voice first, and you'll hear him say, "I'm very, very upset with you." And then you'll hear, "You've got me in a rut." Again, who talks like that, which is crazy. And then you'll hear, this is the creepy voice. You'll hear, "I don't like the way you did it. You're making me lie. You're making me feel cold. You're making me feel just right." And then there's a little bit of static. And then it says, "You make me do harm." Now the two radios start popping off. I'm just giving you a breakdown so you know what to listen for, although you'll hear it. The two radios start popping off. You're going to hear an actual voice of a living person. You'll hear Mr. Creep, and you'll say, "Bob, I just talked to Lewis. He told me what you did." And then you hear a woman's voice, and you hear, "Bob's safe." And then you hear like a question. She's like, "Bob?" Some time, a little bit of time, not much, just a few seconds, goes by, some static, and then you hear a woman's voice go, "Don't." And it's so eerie when you hear this. So at this point, you guys have probably heard teasers that I've shared, but now you guys will get to hear the whole clip as an entirety. So you will hear other people's voice that is a human. We had some visitors with us, and they were very, very excited. So you have to just filter out that part. But the actual physical part that comes across is just so eerie. So we're going to finish the episode with these clips so that you can get goosebumps yourself and go, "Holy crap." And just imagine what was happening during this time. She was strangled. So I do envision, like, "You're making me lie. You're making me cold." And then like you can almost imagine what he's doing. And then you can hear her say, "Don't," like it just gets you. So thanks for joining in today with our Gaines Point murder case. And I really enjoyed this one. I've been holding on to this one actually for some time since I investigated it. And take a look at the murder case. I will share some more information about this one, try to get some more true crime cases. So follow us on all the socials if you would like to keep track of what we're doing. Please subscribe on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will hope to add in some pictures so that you can take a look and see what's happening. And stay tuned for next time on Creepy Confidential.
Bob, I just talked to Lewis. He told me what you did.
Oh, shit.
Bob, did you hear that? Did you hear that?